What's up everybody, welcome to your very first C programming tutorial. In this tutorial we'll see some of the basic topics of the language, starting from the history and introduction to the language, and we'll go till declaration definition of a variable. So with that being said, let's get started. We'll see about first the history of the language, when it was developed. It was developed in the year 1972 by Dennis Ritchie, and the reason for this its development was Unix operating system. It was written for the development of Unix operating system, and but it is used in I should say many operating systems. And for learning any other language, we should first learn the C language, right? And with the introduction to the language, C is a structured programming language. Everything in C has a particular structure which needs to be followed, and like so. Okay, and C is a procedural language. If I don't want to discuss this procedural language point right now, because it's a bit it's a thing like which you will learn later on, right? So leave this right now, but the other topics should be clear to you, right? Moving on, now we'll see data types and variable. Now what is a variable? Variable is a named location to store a value. Whenever we have a value, we can store that value into I should say a variable, and you can think of a variable like a box, on which there's a label, right, which represent the name of the box. So we can put that value pretty much in that box, so that later on we can refer to that box to access that value, right? For example, suppose we have a value 10 and that we store in a box on which there's a label named A, right? So later on we can refer to that value by the name of the box, like A, right? Similarly, this is showing in here, like we have a box and a value 10, and we can pretty much store that 10 into this box, right? So A equals 10 means A is a named location for the constant 10. B equal 10.3 means B is a named location for the constant 10.3. Now over here you can observe two things. A is a box which is storing an integer, and B is a box which is storing 10.3, which is a decimal value. So this gives rise to the another topic which is called the data types, right? So we'll shall see now data types. It specifies that which type of data variable can store. Earlier the variable, I should say A, it was storing value 10, and which is an integer, and B is storing value 10.3, which is a decimal value. So this means that the data type of A would have been like integer, and the data type of B would be like some decimal, which can store some decimal value, right? In C we have the following data types. First is int. This stands for integer, right? Whenever we want to store an integer into a variable, or I should say into a box, we use this data type. char is used for character, float is used for decimal value, long is used for big integers, double is used for big floats, and long it is just used for big and big integer. Like after this long, whenever we have a integer which is greater than this long, then we store this into this long int, right? And there's one more thing. Suppose we have a box A, right, which can store integer, and we have value 10, which is also an integer, we know that. So we can pretty much store this value 10 into a box, okay? And we can only store a value into a box only when the data type of this value matches with the data type of this box, right? Let's take another example. Whenever we have a box B which can store float, we cannot store this value 10 into this box because this value is an integer, and we have a box whose data type is a float. So we should take care of that thing, right? Now we'll see that variable names, restriction on the variable name. We have seen the what a variable is named location, right? So it is a named location, so it should have a particular name, but there are some restriction which needs to be followed by assigning a particular name to a variable. First restriction is that a variable name can only start with an alphabet or an underscore. Like we cannot have a variable name which is starting with any other character or integer as well, right? Let's take let's see some example. First is ABC. Now this is very valid variable name because it is starting with a underscore BC. This is also valid variable name because it is starting with underscore, which is allowed. Now if I have $BC, now this is invalid because it is invalid because of two reasons, but right now we know only one reason, so we'll say okay, it is starting with dollar, and this condition is not satisfied, so it is invalid, and 1BC is similarly is invalid. The other condition is that underscore is the only special character allowed in the variable name. That's why this $BC was invalid, because it is although it is starting with with dollar, which is not allowed, and moreover it has a dollar in this variable name, which is, I mean, not allowed in according to the second condition, right? Only underscore is the special character which is allowed in the variable name. That's why dollar $VC is incorrect. The next restriction is that a variable name cannot start with an integer. That's why this 1 BC was invalid. But in between, if I have like A1C, then this would have worked fine. Like 1 BC, then invalid, and A1C we can have in between integers, right? The next restriction is a variable name cannot have a space in between. Like we cannot have like ABC. If we can have ABC, but we cannot have like A space BC. If I want to, pretty much separate two, I should say, words, I can use something like underscore. Like suppose that my variable name is like this is my variable name. My variable name is this is my variable name. So I can specify like this underscore is underscore my, and so on, right? So you should take care of this restriction. And one more restriction which I have not mentioned over here, the restriction is that a variable name cannot be the some some name which has a predefined meaning in the library. So like if has a particular meaning in the library, we cannot use a variable name like if, while, do while, and do while is a separate, we can use separately, but we cannot use do, we cannot use while, what else, for, we cannot use for, and so on, right? Now declaration and definition. So far we have seen many topics, and those are only for this topic, because all of the previous topics are used in this declaration and definition of a variable. Now what is declaration of a variable? Declaration of variable is pretty much tells us that it's like designing a box, you can say. Okay, designing a box, that's what we call a declaration of variable, right? So how do we do that? It's the syntax of declaration, variable declaration is data type space variable name. We know what a data type is, and according to our needs we can specify the which data type we want, and after that we can specify the variable name. According to the variable name should be, of course, the valid variable name, right? Data type can be int, char, float, and variable name can be any valid variable name like int ABC, right? Now variable definition. What is variable definition? It's like putting the value which we had in, like earlier we have seen we have value 10 and we were storing that value into a box B or A, right? So that storing the box and storing the value into a box is what we call a variable definition, or definition of a variable. So how do we do that? We do that by the syntax of variable definition is variable name equals some constant value. For example, we have already declared this ABC, so we'll say ABC equal 10. Now there is one thing I want to tell you. The variable should be declared before defining. Like this means before putting a value into a box, we should first design the box. Like we cannot, this would not make sense. Like we don't have a box and we are storing some value in that box. That's nonsense, right? So we should take care of that before defining a variable. We should declare, you should declare a variable, right? But here we are doing two things: variable declaration, okay, and the second is variable definition. Now let's take an example. We have variable int a, and I'm writing a equals 10. Now int a is the declaration and a equal 10 is the definition. This is fine, right? Because we are defining variable a after declaring. Now if I write b equals 3, now this won't this will give you an error. Why? Because we don't have a box b, so b is not declared, right? That's why this will give you an error. And here we are doing two things: syntax, variable declaration and definition. What we can do is we can pretty much merge these two things. We have two lines, int a and int a equals 10. We can pretty much merge these two lines by writing something like int a equals 10, a int a equals 10. So this would be like the merging of declaration and definition together, and I personally prefer this thing because I don't know why, but I prefer. So syntax, if I talk about the syntax, then this would not be an issue to understand the syntax. Data type space variable name equal to some constant value. Like we are just merging these two statements, declaration and definition, by this. And that's going to be it for this tutorial. If this video has helped you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel.